Good evening, and thank you so much to our panelists and to our Facebook and Instagram live audiences for joining us tonight. My name is Rebecca Brown. I'm the Director of Policy at the Innocence Project, and I'm joined by an esteemed panel to discuss a new reform effort related to one of the leading causes of wrongful conviction, namely false confessions. There are many contributing factors to false confessions, and a prominent element, the use of deception by law enforcement during the course of custodial interrogations, has been a common feature of interrogations resulting in wrongful conviction. As we begin the conversation, please ask any questions in the comments and we'll try to answer them at the end. You are a huge part of our team and we can't do this work without you and without your support. So please text FREEDOM to 97016 to join our team of advocates for justice and help us to pass these reforms around the country. Here to shed light on the false confession phenomenon are two exonerated men who were also change agents and advocates for the reforms that we're going to be discussing tonight. Both were tragically only 17 years old when they confessed to crimes they did not commit. Marty Tankleff spent 17 years behind bars for the murder of his parents in Long Island, New York. Terrill spent 14 years behind bars or nearly 15 for a rape murder in Illinois, along with his three co-defendants who were known as the Englewood Four. All of his co-defendants had also falsely confessed. We're also joined by Professor Laura Nirider, co-director of the Center on Wrongful Conviction, who represented Mr. Swift and who specializes in false confessions. And finally, we're so pleased that the lawmakers who were successful in passing laws in the state of Illinois and in Oregon, the first in the nation to pass police deception or to ban police deception during custodial interrogations are with us tonight. From the state of Illinois, we're joined by Senator Robert Peters, and from Oregon, Senator Chris Gorsek. False confessions are prevalent in 12% of the nearly 2,900 exonerations that have been revealed in the United States since 1989, numbering more than 350. And while it might be a counterintuitive phenomenon to most, we hope tonight can help to demystify how false confessions happen. And we also plan to discuss the reforms that we need to put in place to defend against false confessions. So let's first hear from the people who have the most to teach us, Marty and Terrill. First of all, I just want to thank you both so much for being with us tonight. And I also want to recognize that every time you're asked to share your experiences with people, it takes something out of you. And so we just want to express our gratitude to you. It's really because of you that we're able to learn about this phenomenon. And it really has been just your courage and grace throughout this that, you know, all of us benefit from. And so we are working, of course, together and collectively to prevent this from happening to others. And I really wanted to begin with both of you, with Terrill and Marty. If you both wouldn't mind, you know, helping us to kind of set the stage for tonight's discussion and just share a little bit with us about your cases. So let's begin with Marty and then move to Terrill.
Sure. In 1988, I just turned 17 on August 29th. And on September 7th, I woke up to really what was a nightmare for me. I discovered that my father was clinging to life and my mother was deceased. Instead of me being able to go with my family to the hospital, I was kidnapped by law enforcement. I was brought 45 minutes away and I was interrogated. I was put into a windowless room with no furniture. And, you know, I was brought up to trust police. And the questioning or the interrogation started off kind of quietly and nicely because they were just kind of curious. And when they weren't getting what they wanted from me, the accusation started. And the interrogation started to get very hostile, verbal, and it got to the point where the lead detective said that my father had been pumped full of adrenaline, had identified me, and that I should just tell them what happened. They said they found my hair in my mother's hands, and that I should just tell them what happened. And it didn't matter what I said to the police. It didn't matter if I said I want a polygraph. It didn't matter if I said I didn't do anything. Their attitude was basically, and their statements were, we don't care, just tell us what we want to hear. And after hours, you start to get to a point where you're mentally drained and physically drained, and you just want out. And you start to say things that you know aren't true. And that's what happened in my case. And, you know, there were statements that were made in the interrogation room, but I've always said that, you know, had law enforcement utilized the technology that they had, which they had recording equipment, it never would have been a he said, she said. because what was interesting about it is that the minute I got out of the confines of the interrogation room and I spoke to a family member, I immediately said, they made me say things that I didn't do. And Suffolk County actually had a policy and procedure back in 1988. They actually did do videotaped interrogations, but they chose not to. And the tragedy of this is that, I've said this time and time again, if interrogations, we're talking about the entire interrogation, when the first question was electronically recorded, so many innocent lives would be saved. And in most jurisdictions where we've employed videotaping or some kind of recording, there's been a reluctance in the very early stages by law enforcement, but after they start utilizing it, they're favorite, and it saves lives. And, our policymakers and our society should understand that when we torture young men to falsely confess to crimes and reincarcerate them, we're left with leaving the guilty parties to remain free and victimize our communities. And that's not something that we want to really talk about, but that's really the consequences of obtaining a false confession.
Thanks so much, Marty. And we'll turn to Terrill just to hear a little bit, Terrill, about sort of your encounter with law enforcement and sort of what it felt like to be a teenager facing an interrogation for a horrible crime that that you didn't commit.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I was also 17 years of age as Marty. This was like back in March of 1995. I wasn't home one night, and the police came to my house looking for me. I wasn't there, but I called my mother the next day just to check in and see how everything was doing. And she told me that the police were looking for me, stating that I was hiding someone. Didn't know what they were talking about. She said, hey, well, go over your father's house, give the police a call, and find out what's going on. I'm like, okay. I waited till my father got off work, called the authorities, said, hey, my name is Terrill Swift. I'm here, the address where I was. They came to the address within 15, 20 minutes. I laid some photographs on the table. Asked me, did I know any of the guys? I didn't know any of the gentlemen. Laid some more photographs on the table. Asked me if I knew any of those gentlemen. I did not. Asked me if I would be willing to come to the police department. And said I wouldn't have a problem with it. Could my father bring me? They said no. Could my uncle bring me? They said no, because my uncle was there. They said, we said, well, can they trail you guys? And they said, yeah, we don't have a problem with it. We're taking you to this police department, and instead put me in the back of a car and took me to the police department on 51st, which was a totally different direction than where he sent my family. That was the beginning stages of the deception for me. And then similar to Martin, you get there, you're a 17-year-old kid, and you have a sense of trust for the police. You would never think that they would do the things that they did to us. The psychological torture, saying that we raped and murdered someone whom I didn't even know, with 4 other young men whom I didn't even know them either. We were 4, 5 Black youths on the south side of Chicago that got pretty much swooped up. Unfortunately, I see that in a lot of the Black and brown cases. I just have to say this. It's usually 3, 4, 5 of us that they're grabbing at one time. It doesn't, and that's something, a whole nother subject. But yeah, I mean, for me, what matters now is just trying to bring some type of awareness to the tactics that they used against us, and show that is not a good practice, because, as Martin stated, the actual perpetrator is still on the street. And in our case, the actual perpetrator stayed on the street and committed more sexual assaults and rapes and murders on other young women and traumatized more families. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. And Terrill, I think, you made a critical point, and I think, we should not just gloss over it, which is to say that this is very much an issue of racial injustice. We know that, the state of Illinois, which is known as the false confession capital of the country, or maybe Chicago is, but that said, the data is shocking out of the state of Illinois. When we took a look at it, it was 101 known false confessions, 91 from men of color, men or women of color. So this was 91, 77 Black men, 14 Latinx folks. So absolutely an issue of racial justice. And I think, absolutely worth focusing on. And that said, I think you both just did an extraordinary job of kind of explaining sort of what it felt like. But, one thing that strikes me in the many years of work that I've done on the false confession phenomenon is this sort of notion that people have, right? That some people sometimes say, I would never falsely confess to a crime I didn't commit, right? That would never happen to me. What do you want the general public to understand, right? What do you want to say to those people?
I've heard that question for years, right? And my reply is, in order for you to understand that, you would have to be there. And I wouldn't want you to be there. Again, you put your mind frame, and we're 17-year-old kids. You're telling us that we're dying in jail for a crime we did not commit, as a kid. And then they sit you in these dark rooms and have you process that as a child, right? You're 17. What do you mean I'm dying? I haven't even lived yet. And the deception, it's so easy for the deceit to come in because they see that vulnerability. And then another guy comes in, hey, I believe you. And it's that simple. But to understand, to fully grasp the weight of that, you would have to be there. And I wouldn't want that on anyone.
I think we can also simplify it. When I speak to larger audiences on this issue, I ask usually the whole crowd, I go, how many people have siblings? Stand up. How many people, when you were very young, you and your siblings were home, your parents went out on let's say a lamp broke. Your parents came home and said, okay, who broke the lamp? And which one of you in the room didn't break the lamp, but they stood up and said they broke the lamp because they wanted to go out for ice cream? And all of a sudden you see about 50% of the people remain standing. And I go, you just confessed to breaking a lamp that you didn't do for ice cream. I said, you just confessed to something you didn't do. Magnify that by 1 million times. Okay. And now put yourself in somebody's shoes. You admitted to breaking a lamp for ice cream. I said, imagine when you've somebody saying, we're going to execute you. We're going to put you in prison for the rest of your lives. We're not letting you out of this room till you tell us what we want to hear. Yeah. It gets to a point where you'll say anything.
That's a great segue into my question for Laura, because I'd love to hear, Laura, a bit about sort of the history, of interrogations, because, I think we all have heard of the third degree, and, the fact that, physical torture used to be sort of commonplace in the interrogation procedures, although that's not to suggest that there aren't still aspects of that in interrogations, but very interested in kind of hearing from you about this sort of history of how we moved in this country in terms of dealing with interrogations.
Yeah, absolutely, Rebecca. And, I think the history actually helps us understand this all-important question, right? Why would anyone confess to a crime that he or she did not commit, right? So the history has everything to do with Chicago, which is where I am right now. Back in the day, across the country, as you said, about 100 years ago, the main interrogation technique that was used was the third degree, right? Physical abuse. So people would be literally hung outside windows until they confessed, or they'd be roughed up inside the station house, or they'd have a gun put to their head. And that was commonplace about 100 years ago, until a law professor in Chicago, who actually taught at the same school that I teach at now, Northwestern Law School, in the 1940s and 50s said, these physical abuse techniques are barbaric and they cause false confessions, right? It's so easy for us to understand why anyone would confess to a crime that he or she didn't commit if you're being tortured or physically abused. So his great insight in the 1940s said, let's be progressive, let's be enlightened, let's get rid of these barbaric tactics. Instead, let's develop a set of psychological techniques that will replace physical abuse, right? That's the big insight from the 1940s here in Chicago, right? And at the time, it was very progressive, very enlightened. Those techniques, that set of psychological techniques that were developed here almost 75 years ago, are still in use today around the country in all 50 states, right? In fact, I guarantee as we're sitting here today, I guarantee someone is being interrogated right now using these techniques. And they're the techniques that we heard Martin and Terrill describe, right? The way psychological interrogation works, it's a two-stage process. The first stage is about reducing a suspect down to hopelessness. So they bring you inside the interrogation room, they cut you off from your parents or your sources of support, your friends, everybody else. You're alone in the room, and they tell you the case against you is rock solid. You're caught, you're cornered, you're trapped. We found your DNA at the scene. We found your fingerprints on the gun, even if that's not true. Police are in most states now, not Illinois, Oregon, thanks to these incredible leaders who are with us tonight, but police are allowed to lie about evidence during interrogation in order to make you feel hopeless, cornered, trapped. They say they've got evidence against me. They're not listening to me protest my innocence. What am I going to do, right? Then comes the second stage of interrogation. Once that person feels cornered, trapped, hopeless, you offer confession as a way out, right? So like Martin and Terrill were saying, if you don't confess, you'll face the death penalty, right? Or you'll face life in prison. But if you do confess, if you do cooperate, you express remorse, right? People will want to help you. The judge will understand that you're a good guy, a good woman, a good person, right? And it's going to go so much easier for you, right? That's how these psychological techniques work to extract confessions. They are very, very powerful techniques that are very good at getting true confessions, but they are so powerful that they also get false confessions all across the country. These techniques rely on deception from front to back, from beginning to end. And that deception is now identified as a huge risk factor for false confessions, the same way that physical abuse was back in the day.
You know, it's so interesting that you say that because, you know, just also thinking about, you know, protections that, you know, would be available to people, like including counsel, right? Innocent people typically don't ask for that. Right? They don't ask for counsel because they think it will all be sorted out. So, you know, and oftentimes folks that, you know, actually did commit the crime will seek that protection. So it's a bit perverse, right? That oftentimes, you know, innocent people who would most benefit from an attorney in that moment, right, are not seeking that because of the trust, frankly, that they hold in law enforcement. They don't believe that there will be that kind of deception. So I think it's just, and also just wanted to return a little bit to Marty again and Terrill. You both described a little bit about the deception that was used. I know, Marty, you mentioned that they talked about the presence of your hair in your mother's hand. If you could speak a bit about sort of the scope of the deception used during your interrogation, you know, sort of what were those examples of, you know, false evidence that they were presenting to you?
So in addition, so my father never woke. My hair wasn't in my mother's hands. They also said that the issue about me taking a shower, they said they tested all the traps and they didn't believe me. They said that the knife that was discovered had pink substance on it, which meant that it was actually the murder weapon when the pink substance was actually watermelon. They said the blunt force instrument was a dumbbell that was found in my room, and the dumbbell was completely examined microscopically down to, I think, like a millionth of a centimeter or whatever. And there was absolutely no trace evidence whatsoever. And every issue that the police that I confessed to, as far as factually, even stuff about things in my life, it all panned out not to be true. You know, some of the physical evidence that actually came out was that the people who were responsible for the crimes wore gloves. And there was never gloves mentioned in my confession, because the confession that came out was only evidence of what law enforcement knew that morning from their visual walkthrough of my house. It wasn't based on actual facts. And it's something that I've always said is that if they would have recorded that interrogation, you know, we would have saw how long it actually lasted. Because I remember, you know, going into police headquarters when it was light out, and I remember not leaving till it was dark out. And, you know, nobody really knows how long the interrogation took place because Suffolk County chose not to follow their own rules. There was no proper record keeping. But it's problematic because tragically, the Supreme Court allows law enforcement to lie in Suffolk, and Suffolk has a huge history of obtaining confessions. I think it's probably the #1 homicide division in the country for confessions. I think they were at their highest point. I think they had 99% confession rate, but on average, it was like 90 to 98% for years.
And Terrill, I don't know if you wanted to kind of speak a little bit about that deception and what you were experiencing.
Yeah, I mean, again, the first lie was you sent my family. The first lie was you said I was hiding someone. You're looking for me. You're lying to me and my family saying that you're looking for me saying I'm hiding someone, right? Then, you lie to my family. But as far as in the interrogation room, it was, everything that I wrote or I said in the false confession was things that I heard from them. It was like all of that was a lie. She was, it's like everything, Rebecca. It's like it's so much. It's like where do I even start, right? It's like because every single step was a complete lie. It's like everything, and it's in my case it was it was just a sexual case, and there was DNA involved, and you have 5 kids that say that they raped someone, 5 young teens. 15, 16, 17, and no DNA. Like, we're so smart to leave not a trace of DNA, but so stupid to sign a confession. You know what I mean? It's like, come on, it's like everything was tragic, everything was all a lie, our whole arrest, everything up until us finally getting exonerated. Yeah.
It's extraordinary because, as you're describing this to me, right? I mean, it's so clear, right? That, and just as you're talking about this, right? We're talking about like pretty unreliable confessions at this point, right? As you said, that you would produce no physical evidence with 5 people, right? And so, it brings me to my next question to Laura, right? Which is really, do courts consider the reliability of confession evidence before they let it in and let fact finders like judges and juries hear it? Do they consider that?
Right. So misconception number 1 is that no one would confess to a crime that he or she didn't commit. And misconception number 2 is that if that were to happen, a court would handle it and would throw out that confession. But that isn't how that works, right? So when any of us are inside the interrogation room, the protections that we all as Americans have come from the 5th Amendment to the US Constitution, right? Everybody's heard of the 5th Amendment. You take the stand in court, you don't want to incriminate yourself, so you plead the 5th, right? The 5th Amendment gives us all the protection to not be forced to incriminate ourselves. We can't be forced to confess. But that's the only protection that amendment gives us, right? It doesn't protect us against confessing falsely. It only protects us from being forced to confess, whether that confession is true or false, which is why when you hear arguments in court or maybe on TV about confessions, the argument always is, well, this person was coerced into confessing, right? This confession was involuntary, right, against somebody's will. Those are the only arguments that courts are allowed to consider when they're deciding whether to admit a confession. So Terrill's case is a great example. In your case, Terrill, despite the confessions, right, you were all charged, well, based on the confessions, you were all charged, but before trial, DNA testing came back, conclusively proving that you and your co-defendants were not the perpetrators.
Yeah.
That's a classic example of the kind of evidence that courts are not allowed to consider when deciding whether or not to admit a confession. That's why reforms like what we're talking about today are so crucial, because they refocus the discussion on reliability.
Right. And, and I think to kind of get to the heart of, whether or not a confession is even reliable, you really need to have a record of that. Right. So the first generation of reforms that, organizations like the Innocence Project and the Center on Wrongful Conviction sought to pursue was to record the custodial interrogation from start to finish. Right. Not just at that point in time where the confession was prepared and the person was ready to confess, and then they turn on the tape and now you have this perfectly tailored confession with no sense of what led up to that confession, right? So the first reform that we really sought to pass, right, around the country was really foundational, right, which was the recording of interrogations. And, Laura, I'd love your thoughts about kind of why this reform is so important and how it helps juries and judges to assess whether or not, a confession was, well, even voluntary.
Sure. Well, it goes back to the history, right? So in the 40s and 50s, we came up with these psychological techniques that are still in use today. And for decades, we went along and said, isn't that great? We fixed the problem of false confessions, right? Because we don't use the third degree widely any longer. But a couple of things happened, right? And the first big thing that happened was that DNA technology was invented and started being used to test the reliability of these confessions, right? And all of a sudden, we're realizing that these confessions are being proven false much more often than we ever could have imagined, and under circumstances that are different than what we had hypothesized, right? Because we thought that these psychological techniques wouldn't result in false confessions. They definitely do. And that's what we started learning from DNA. So then, thanks to the leadership, like you say, of the Innocence Project, the Center on Wrongful Convictions, organizations across the country, we started saying, well, look, if these confessions are being proven false, we need to know what's happening inside the interrogation room. We have to pull back that cloak of secrecy, open the door, let in the light, and figure out what's going on that's making this really counterintuitive thing happen that's causing innocent people to confess to crimes they didn't commit. And that's the genius of electronic recording laws, right? Laws across the country in 28 states now, I think, requiring
to 30.
30. All right. That's the best news I've heard all night. So now 30 states, right, require interrogations to be video or audio taped in some way, the whole thing, not just the statement at the end. But that means we've got 20 states left to go. So that's an important reform to push as well. But that's laid the foundation for what we're talking about here today, because now we have these videotapes. We can go in and analyze and study and research, and we can identify these deceptive interrogation tactics as a major risk factor for false confessions.
Thank you. And, interestingly, a little known state senator at the time in Illinois named Barack Obama sponsored the first law in the country to record custodial interrogations. And sitting in that same Senate seat today is Senator Robert Peters, who is the sponsor of the first law in the nation that banned police deception during interrogations of people under the age of 18. So, it was only appropriate that Illinois was the first state to pass this law, given its unenviable status as false confession capital of the country. But Illinois has produced just so many false confessions. And so, Senator Peters, I wanted to hear from you about sort of what motivated your sponsorship of this legislation, and if you could share a little bit, about how it was received by other lawmakers when you first introduced it.
Yeah, so thank you. And I actually just want to thank Marty and Terrill for being on, and for everybody who's organizing around these issues. I think that we need to expand the scope of what it means to have public safety in our community, in our world. And part of that, I think, lies at being able to trust the government or trust the state to be a steward that looks out for you. So on a macro level and on a principally big level, it was really driven by the idea that if it's okay to lie to a child, and that is literally part of a state action or a state apparatus, that fundamentally people will not have faith and trust not only in the state but also in each other. You essentially isolate people to such a extreme degree of individualism that's not helpful for anybody and doesn't look out for anybody. A second thing on a more like a smaller personal level is I had a privilege. My dad was a civil rights lawyer and a criminal defense attorney, but I've been interrogated by police and told all types. We're live. I can't curse. So my foul mouth I'm going to restrain it. But all types of BS. And the fact is that they were kind of shocked to find out that I knew I was going to have my dad come in, and I'm not going to say anything to them. But the amount of extreme pressure, and you heard it from Marty and heard it from Charlie, the amount of extreme pressure that's put on you to say anything, to get out of that space is disgusting, and it's vile. So fundamentally, It's the macro level of being able to trust and invest in each other and believe in each other, and not to practice the worst forms of cynicism about your neighbor, your friend, your community. And on a micro level, it's that very experience, the very idea of being under that much pressure. And to do that to people over and over again is not about making communities safe. It's about getting a win. It's about seeing something zero sum, about being able to have a victory in your, whether it's with your coworkers in the police department or wherever it might be. And the fact is, if you're having a public safety program based off of wins and losses, it's not about what human people need in order to get by in life. And if we don't move to focusing on what people need, and we're stuck here, it's only going to make matters worse. It's only going to make more and more trauma happen over and over again. So on both a macro level, on a broader ideological level, and on a smaller personal level, it's about the idea of trust and the idea of confronting injustice and the amount of pain and trauma that so many people are having. If you listen to Marty, I think, Marty, you said 1988, and Terrill, you said 1995. That is during a period of rapid, tough on crime ramp up. The very idea of not being able to see in each other the amount of love and care that we need is literally ramping up during that period of time. And in Illinois and in Chicago, I mean, we're a city that produced John Birch, right? This is not only confession, but torture. That third rail is something that's historically tied to the city that we fundamentally needed to move away from. So this was a passion on a broader level of what it means for us to have good, safe, and connected communities where we can believe and trust in each other. And it is not about having this zero-sum game of win and losses that does nothing to keep people safe.
So true. And Senator Peters, how do you think your colleagues responded to the proposal when it was introduced?
To be very frank, I think they were initially very skeptical. And to be honest, I mean, we in the Black Caucus passed 4 historic pieces of pillars. One of them involved a large criminal justice package. I think that as people learned about the bill, and this is where, in all honesty, it's not just the fact of the work that I did on the floor or that Rep. Slaughter, I believe, did in the House, but also the advocates having conversations with people. It moved to the point where it was a bill that I was very anxious to be able to move to becoming a bipartisan bill with broad support. Even the Republican minority leader in the House came on as a co-sponsor and spoke of the bill. So there's a few things there. People might be skeptical, but what you realize is that when you take organization and you have those conversations with people, it can fundamentally shift the conversation that I like to say under the dome within the Capitol.
Right. Really helpful. And, and hailing from Oregon is Senator Chris Gorsek, whose bill, I believe, was signed within hours of the Illinois law. So maybe the time difference makes it a tie. I'm not sure. Senator Gorsek, oh, no, there's disagreement. We'll never know. But I will say, Senator Gorsek, I was so moved that as a former police officer yourself, you sponsored a similar bill in Oregon. And I was just interested to hear sort of personally, kind of what moved you to work on this issue? And did you find similar support from police and sheriffs in Oregon?
Well, thank you for having me, by the way. As you've already said, I worked for law enforcement. I was a Portland police officer from 1980 to the end of 87. And during that time, we were definitely trained in these techniques. And while I certainly used that against some suspects, it was never something that I thought was a great way of doing things. And after I left, I've been a teacher in criminal justice since, 97. But, the more I studied this, the more it became apparent to me that these sorts of tactics are extremely damaging and can lead to some very counterproductive results. Now, what led me first we did it in 3 bills, actually, and Senator Peters was just talking, and you were just talking about the question of recording. we found, first off, that we weren't recording juvenile interrogations. And it's like, really? We recorded them for adults, but we weren't doing it for children. And the one thing I think everyone can agree on is that when you have that documentation, when somebody says this wasn't done correctly, well, we just can simply go back and look. And so sometimes it may lean towards law enforcement, other times it leans away. But I think it makes the process cleaner and more accurate. So the political decision was, let's approach this incrementally. And Senator Peters, I'm sure you know too, when you try to bring a huge change forward, it can really be difficult, as we like to talk about the heavy lift. So we decided, my office and some of our supporters, by the way, we were helped very much by folks in the Center for Wrongful Conviction. In fact, Laura and Rebecca and many others, Stephen Drizzen, helped us with these projects. So the first thing we did was we approached it from, we want all kids that would, if they were an adult, have committed a felony to be, when they're interrogated, we want it documented. And what's really interesting is that the committee chair for Judiciary at the time actually tried to kill the bill. And he's like, nope, maybe you could try next session. And I talked to the Speaker of the House, and the Speaker made sure that the bill did move forward and did come out of committee. So, Speaker Kotek did a great job on that and assisting us in saying, no, I think this is a really good bill and it should move forward. And then we managed to pass it in the House and then in the Senate. So when that was completed, then it was like, okay, now in the next session, which was 2019. So we have every other year, we have the long session. So in 2019, we ran a bill that said, now if they were charged with what would be a misdemeanor, you have to record. And the idea is now, anytime a juvenile is interrogated, we will have that electronic documentation so that we know. Getting back to the question of data, for instance, you can't really fully evaluate things unless you have the data. And I don't know about Illinois, but the one thing that we heard opponents say over and over is, oh, those things don't happen in Oregon. It's like, well, we're like Disneyland. I mean, it's some sort of fantasy land where we would never have that happen in our state. But I think that's, it's my state and I don't believe these things happen. So we did that. And then this last session, we were able to once again move forward. And again, with the help of many of you, we were able to basically get the bill passed that said, very much like in Illinois, sorry, but you don't get to deceive kids to get a confession. And this all started, this set of three bills for me started because of the story I encountered of some kids that actually were being accused of a crime that they didn't commit, and the lying was going on, and the attempt to isolate the kid from the parent, all sorts of things. And some of the parents going, "Oh, just tell the truth," and others going, "No, remain silent and get a lawyer." I mean, I tell all of my students, remain silent and have a lawyer. That's what the Fifth Amendment is for. So that's how we came to be involved in this. The interesting thing was that we were able to get the police unions to neutral. And Kevin Campbell, who is the lobbyist for the chiefs and sheriffs, really worked with us to get it to a point where the chiefs and sheriffs actually supported the bill. And so we were really, really, really fortunate. The other thing is we had the context, especially in this session, of all of the, the tremendous outcrying after the Chauvin assault and killing. that just a horrendous thing. And that really led to a lot of push in Oregon, and I'm sure in Illinois and other states, for police reform. So that was part of this too. And we have a People of Color Caucus. They were very helpful in helping to move this forward, because again, we know that a lot of times, not entirely, but a lot of times, it's kids of color that are getting sucked into this system. But the one thing I wanted to say is, going back to Marty and then Terrill, we know now that brain chemistry is such that the sophistication, the adult sophistication, really doesn't fully develop until you're about 25 years old. So to put a 17, 16, 15-year-old in that position and go, well, they look like adults, they must think like adults, it's not true. And we know that now. So that, I think it's incumbent upon us to say, wait a minute, we know that's not true. Now, like I said, our next step will be to say, because I had several people say this to me, well, Chris, why isn't it about adults too? And it was like, again, incremental steps, right? But the one thing, if anything, that was really interesting was that in this go round, my caucus actually wanted to make it bigger, wanted to expand it more. And it would have run into so many problems, and we would have run out of time trying to sort them out, that we stayed with where we were. And then it moved forward. And it had to go through rules plus the regular committee. So it had a lot of hoops to go through, but it passed quite well. I'm very pleased with it.
As are we. And just wanted to kind of touch on a point that you were making, right? Which is that, in many instances, we have to approach this work incrementally as much as we, and as an advocate, of course, I'm always feeling frustration, like, can't we do it for this one, right? But so I guess a question for both of you, both senators, is, sort of, how would you like to build on this reform? And or were there provisions that you wish you could have gotten in this proposal that you didn't get, and because of politics? And how would you like to build on it in the future?
I'm going to just lift up what Senator Gorsek said, which is, I got asked, I go on like WGN radio or something, and they're like, well, what about adults? And then I'm sitting there like, I don't know if this is supposed to be a gotcha, but yeah, I'd also not believe that we should be trying to deceive adults. Because especially for me, if you fundamentally believe we need to actually have some sort of trust and faith in each other, and not this sort of individualized cynicism about people, then you can't say that you're okay with lying to adults during interrogation. So yeah, I think to lift up what Senator Gorsek said is like, the next step is, all right, now it's just adults we have to go to next to make some change happen.
No, I agree with that. And the incremental thing, I mean, it is, Rebecca, you're so right. It's like, we have these great ideas, and then we realize politically the reality is that it'll have to come in chunks. And it is very frustrating. But I think definitely for myself as well, I agree totally with Senator Peters that we need to now approach this in terms of adults, and of course, spread this from more states than just Illinois and Oregon. Absolutely.
Well, that is so helpful. And I'm going to now turn to some questions from our audience. The one question comes from Michelle from Facebook, who asks, in regards to brain development and juvenile justice, are there legislative acts in the pipeline which take into account the brain development stages by age? And so it sounds very similar to what we were just discussing.
Right.
I can answer. In Illinois, there's been a push constantly to change the age, particularly to our juvenile justice system. I try to also tie in our youth in care, our DCFS, with when it comes to the criminal legal system, that they're actually more tied together. And those are always pushes, but like has been said, you're essentially, you need to, what makes things happen is a combination of outside and inside game strategy, right? So there's a lot of ideas that we want to see changes on, and sometimes they have only outside pushing or they only have inside pushing, but they need both. And as Senator Gorsek said about Oregon, right, what happened coming out of 2020 and that crisis, that was a clear example of the outside and the inside came together. In Illinois, similarly happened when we passed the pillars that led to not only just the beginning of the year in January when that passed and got signed, but also throughout session, which included our bill that banned deception, right? Like those things all came from a combination of outside and inside strategy. And I think that we need to continue to build off of that and understand that they each play some role.
And what I will say is, first off, I think Senator Peters is absolutely right on that. The second thing is in Oregon, with the Oregon Youth Authority, we have some very progressive policies there that have been developing, and I expect that to continue. And the one thing, there has been a lot more emphasis on the concern around like brain chemistry and brain development and all of that, and trying to make the facilities for those few kids that actually are held in a custody situation, get the right sort of treatment. And they're trying to approach things trying to even change the environment so it doesn't look like a prison, which I think the environment is a huge, huge piece of this. But the other thing is, we now have it so that, let's say you're 17 and you get a sentence that will last for like 4 years. What we now do is we keep the kid in the juvenile system, even though they pass 18, and we don't transfer people over to the Department of Corrections for adults until they turn 25, because there's a concern about the psychological impacts of that and that they can get better treatment on the juvenile side.
Right, that's really helpful. And Laura, this is a question for you. Before I get to that, though, I do want to just note for folks that Terrill had to catch a flight, so I didn't want folks to be concerned. And we are so grateful to him for joining us for the short time that he could. So just wanted to note that. But a question for you, Laura, which is, how long can interrogators question a minor? Is there a limit? I've heard of interrogations that last for over 16 hours. So thanks to Albert for that question.
Yeah, thanks very much for that question. And I think I'm seeing a lot of comments out there. By the way, I just want to shout you all out, all the people here in support of my client, Brendan Dassey. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being here. And thank you for fighting him as we are continuing to do. Brendan's case is a good example of the fact that there are so few rules that actually govern what happens inside the interrogation room. He was a 16-year-old special education student who was questioned 4 times over a period of 48 hours with no lawyer present. The first go round, his parents weren't even notified that he was being questioned, right? And this went on and on and on until, of course, he confessed to a crime. But you don't have to be a lawyer to know he didn't commit, right? A crime that he wasn't even able to describe without being told the answer. There are so many risk factors for false confession out there that are yet to be addressed, because we're still learning about this phenomenon, still studying it. But that's why we're so grateful, not only for the leadership of yourself, Senator Gorsek, Senator Peters, people who are in the room, like you were saying, Senator Peters, who can make a difference, but also for just ordinary, everyday folks who know people, right? Who are vulnerable, who remember what it's like to be a teenager or a child, right? Who know somebody who maybe might be manipulable, and who has the compassion and common sense and human decency to care about doing the right thing. That's what this movement and this movement is about. That's why we're all here tonight. So thanks to everybody for being here. And yeah, we're going to keep on fighting to make sure these rules change and to help everybody who's been a victim of them.
And if I could just add one thing, Senator Peters was talking earlier about the whole Get Tough movement coming out of the 80s and into the 90s. What's really crazy about that was the claim that juvenile justice was not dealing properly with most kids. It turns out, if you look at it, it was only a small subset of very hardcore offenders that weren't being dealt with properly. And everybody else was basically undergoing experiences in the juvenile justice system that were appropriate. But this excuse then was used to say, oh, now we got to get tough and we've got to be very tough on all of these kids. And we had John DeLulio saying, oh, we're going to have these super predators and just absolutely insane statements about kids. So, but that idea, nothing works, it was so miscast. It made the problem worse.
I know we have like only so much time, but like if I could piggyback off of this, because it's, you know, it gets, I think that it's important to remember as we head into what I think is a reaction to the organizing that happened in 2020, the uprisings that happened in 2020, where I think for many of us, we saw it as a sort of a new hope, to get really nerdy about it. And I would say 2021 has felt like the Empire Strikes Back in many ways, like as this summer has happened. And it's important to remember that it is almost always entirely a political project. Yeah. These things aren't divorced from the politics. We don't need to get into that right here, right now, but it is important to remember that oftentimes it's a political project, it's an ideological project, and the conversations about safety, self, liberty, and freedom are something that we're always constantly grappling with and fighting with. And so when we think as we move into next year, which is in itself going to be very political, it's going to be a midterm year at the federal level and so many other places, that we will see people try to attack the work we've done now for, you know, making someone's job harder or whatever it might be that they might say. And it's important to note that it's not data or grounded in reality of what it does to keep communities safe. It's part of a larger political project. And I tell my colleagues, particularly who are in more moderate spaces, that if you react to it, it will only make things worse. They want your reaction. If you hold back from reacting and you put your narrative out there, you can, you know, somewhat inoculate yourself from what they want from you. It's like a bully. They want to keep picking on you, and the more you react, the more they're going to keep going.
Really helpful. And I'm going to end with a question from Latoya, who asks, is there a national resource that has a listing of helpful laws and or rights by state that can help young people better understand the laws in the states that they live in? And I'm going to turn this over to Laura, but one thing that we do have on our website, innocenceproject.org, is a compendium of all of the reporting of interrogation laws, and also the two new laws in Illinois and Oregon that ban deception. So there is, you can look at our website and look by state. There's a scroll down that says, how is my state doing? And you can find not only a description of the law that is passed in your jurisdiction, hopefully, but also a link to that statute, and you can read it yourself. But I don't know, Laura, if you had other resources you'd like to share.
Absolutely. It's a great question. And I think, you know, for all of us, as we sort of learn collectively together about what we can do to fight wrongful convictions and false confessions, education is such an important step. Of course, the Innocence Project website is a wonderful resource. The Center on Wrongful Convictions website is about to relaunch, so stay tuned. We're going to have a lot of great data and information there, including some specifically geared at how to protect our kids. And the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers also has a wonderful website full of maps. So you can, if you're from the US, you can click on your state and find out what the state of play is in your affair, and what the state of affairs and play is in your state, so that you can get going in organizing and around your own community, right? Use that education that you've undertaken, right? Write to your local policymakers, write letters to the editor, talk to your neighbors, talk to the parents of your kids at school, talk to everybody you can about the need to make change. Post on social media, post on Facebook, post on Instagram, get involved with events like this, get politically active in your community, because it's together we are going to make these changes that will protect kids, that will protect adults, that will protect all of us from wrongful convictions.
And one way to interrupt that narrative, that Marty was talking about, this idea of people still being out there to commit terrible offenses, that it does no good to wrongfully convict people. And So you can approach the inevitable, you don't want us to be safe, by saying, well, actually, I do want you to be safe, because we're not solving anything or making people safe by saying that we caught the wrong person.
More of a common sense approach, and I think public safety approach that,
right.
If we employ proper techniques, proper precautions, will prevent innocent people from being arrested, convicted, and really, will train people to do the jobs the right way.
Right.
It doesn't make sense to rush to judgment, rush to get somebody to get a confession, and let the perpetrators remain free. If we spend a little more time investigating crimes or alleged crimes, we may not have as many wrongful convictions, which would ensure that we wouldn't have that many more guilty people remain free and commit these crimes. And, I've been working with the Innocence Project for almost 11, 12 years. And to me, it just makes no sense why we don't have 50 states who have bills that were just passed in Oregon and Illinois. It's illogical, because I think it's such a common sense understanding that, we should protect children. If I lied to somebody in the IRS, I could be charged with a crime. If I lied during an FBI interview, I could be charged with a crime.
Right.
So it makes no sense why law enforcement are able to lie about anything. And if they're actually doing their jobs, they're doing it properly, there really should be no need to lie to anybody, whether it's a child, whether it's an adult, whether it's anybody. And I think what we need to do is kind of step back and refocus the attention, refocus the training of law enforcement, because when you employ the proper tactics, the end results are much better.
Yeah.
Well, Marty, I think none of us could have said it better. But what I will say is you and I have a lot of work to do this year here in New York, in the Empire State, where there has been a bill introduced, Senate Bill 324 by Senator Delnor Myrie, to ban deception, not only for young people, but also for adults. So I look forward to working with you this year here in New York. And for all of the folks that are out there around the country, there will be similar efforts in multiple states. We've already heard from states around the country interested in doing the same kind of legislation sponsored by our champions, Senator Peters and Senator Gorsek, in their states. So with that, we encourage everyone to please text FREEDOM to 97016 to join our team. When you join our team, you will be working collaboratively with the Innocence Project, with the Center on Wrongful Conviction, on various proposals around the country. We could not do this without you. And I just cannot thank this esteemed panel enough. We are so grateful for all of you to join us tonight. And of course to Terrill, who is hopefully flying safe somewhere. So thank you so much. And really just could not be more lucky to have you all with us tonight. So, and thanks to our audience.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you.